Vish, you've been writing about the last Ashes tour in Australia, 21-22, when England lost 4-0. Tell us about it. What did you learn while you were researching for it?
What I learned was, I think, to a point, what everyone has found out about the tour since, really, which isn't to say you shouldn't read it, but what I found was that with the benefit of time, a lot of people looked back on the tour, particularly players I was able to speak to about it, with, I suppose, a bit more understanding of, for example, what, say, an Ashley Giles um, had to do, what he had to work with to help get the tour on, because obviously it was financially driven because of the millions that would have been lost if this hadn't been played, the collateral for Cricket Australia, the broadcasters, and then in turn the ECB. It was also about repaying favours that for touring teams that came to England, and Australia did at the end of that 2020 summer to play those limited overs games. And I think the players, for example, with Giles in particular, saw him as a bit of a bouncer, telling them what they couldn't do and stuff like that, and them having a bit more empathy about that time, because when they were in the midst of it, I mean, some of the stories are pretty grueling, really, about what they went through, what they knew they were going to go through, but the toll it then took on them, whether it was the 2 week quarantine or just the constantly shifting, I suppose, parameters. Because by and large, Australia was pretty open. You know, they were affected by COVID, but maybe not in the same way that England were. And because of the way 2021 had progressed, there was that hard quarantine that both teams did on the tours of Sri Lanka and India. And I say both teams as in both host teams as well. You then come into the 2021 summer, and by and large, cricket was basically back to normal. I appreciate the last test of that summer gets called off because of COVID issues, with that India game at Old Trafford. But by and large, it was all pretty normal. You know, the 100 started in that first year, and there were restrictions there that were flaunted by a lot of people taking part, and by and large, everyone kind of got away with it. And then they go to Australia, and it feels like lockdown one, and because of that, all the things just get exacerbated. All the issues become so much more pointed. Bear in mind that is a tour that England have only won once in in the 21st century. So it's not like England went there with any great hope, but I think they just didn't realise how grueling it was going to be. Yeah.
Stuart Broad famously said a couple of years ago that he'd written it off as a void series in his head, given the impact that the pandemic and the restrictions had on the England team and on the series. Do you think, looking back, there was ever a chance that England could win that series? Sort of, firstly, with the squad that they sent over there, which was not their strongest that they've sent to Australia by any means. But secondly, given the prevailing conditions, could a better England team have competed more than they did?
I mean, that is a. I feel like we could ask that question about any Ashes, couldn't we? Over the last 25 years, but I suppose the one takeaway that I had was I covered that series remotely from the UK, and watching it on TV, it looked like every other Ashes series. It felt like England were picking they got to a stage where they were picking 11 for the match before. Stuart Broad played 3 tests, and only one of them was live because the series was gone after 12 days. There were moments where England competed, and then Australia just, stepped on the accelerator and moved further ahead, and that all just feels like stories of bygone Ashes. But by all accounts, when England left the UK, the prevailing sense was no, they weren't going to do it. No one went there with anything but a bit of, you know what, if conditions fall our way, if this, that, and the other happens, then maybe this will be a series where we can actually compete. But I think even before the first test, I think there was a general sense of, yeah, this is already quite tough. Not least because they had 2 practice games lined up against the England Lions. They only ended up seeing out 7 sessions. It was all a bit of a farce because of the COVID regulations. For example, when they were allowed to train while quarantining on the Gold Coast, whenever they had to change things in the field. For example, move a net. All the players had to get off, and then when enough time had passed, the ground staff would come on and then move the net, and then they'd come off, and then enough time would have to pass for the players to come back on. Bear in mind, they had a very strict 3-hour window when they were allowed to train. Things like that ate into it. Also, bear in mind that people might forget that not only were families on this tour, but the England Lions did the whole thing as well. Very similar to this winter where they ran parallel with the first 2 tests. And so there was about, it was a group of about 60 people they had to cater for, really. And just the challenges of that, just the admin that went into it was quite absurd. An admin that began well into the summer as well, with the calls and meetings that the ECB, of which Joe Root was privy to, that they had to have with not just Cricket Australia, but the Australian government, and then having to get involved with the different states as well. It was, by the time they got there, they were already pretty tired of it, and it only got worse. And to be fair, it is in part because of the weather, but still remarkable that they didn't lose 5-0, because that had 5-0 written all over it.
And I think, sort of looking back to that series, probably, I'll be interested to hear, probably only whets the appetite for this one more, because that felt like such a low ebb for an England team that was on the decline. It was obviously, most of the way through that run of 1 win in 17 under Joe Root's captaincy. You also had the fact of there only being a handful of English fans there, and those were the ones based in Australia, whereas this time, obviously, it feels like it's going to be a proper series. Feels like it's probably going to be a bit more competitive on the field, and you're also going to have, I think, across the course of the series, estimates of 40, 50,000 Barmy Army members or supporters down in Australia, and hopefully will be a bit more of a spectacle and occasion than the last one.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because obviously famously Rory Burns gets bowled off the first ball of the 21-22 series, and certainly some of the players that I've spoken to, when the crowd goes up for that wicket, they said that was actually quite a nourishing moment, because that was the first time it felt like an Ashes, because that atmosphere was there. Because up until then, they'd been, taking endless amounts of PCR tests, were being essentially shepherded away from the public, and I suppose all the things that come with an Australian tour that this England team are currently experiencing now. And bear in mind as well that on this current Ashes tour, there are only 5 players who did the 21-22 tour in the main squad, although Harry Brook was also in the Lions. And Harry Brook was actually in the crowd on day 1 at the Gabba, and, messaged a few players to say, like, God, this is pretty cool. So that, that's probably the first experience of Ashes cricket in Australia. But yeah, I suppose, Ben Stokes and Brendan McCullum, when they come in, they talk about Test cricket wanting to be fun, wanting to entertain, wanting to make it seem like a more aspirational place. In part, it's because of that tour. I know you mentioned the results of 1 win in 17, but because so much of that happened during COVID, like it must have been such a nuisance to play for England, which is not what it's supposed to be about. And yeah, the toll on the players, the toll on, and quite literally the weight of the cap became that much heavier, and the inconveniences of it all. That, I mean, I'm not saying it was an easy job to turn around the results, but it's certainly an easy job to turn around the vibe of that team, because it was on its knees by the end of that winter.
The most recent ball in an Ashes series in Australia, full bunger from Pat Cummins. Ollie Robinson's planted his front foot a strip over, and there's clean bowled. It feels like Robinson, he's back in Australia this time. He's playing grade cricket over in Sydney, and he's been bowling to a couple of the New South Wales players in the nets. It feels like he's gone on a really interesting journey since, in that he's a player with 76 Test wickets at 22, and yet he was nowhere near the squad for this one. What's happened since? Yeah,
it feels like I didn't see this latest chapter in the Ollie Robinson story of him turning into a double agent and helping Australia prepare for this Ashes. Obviously, I'm joking. He's not a double agent. He might yet still come into the fray for this series. I suppose the story of Ollie Robinson falling out of favour with England is a story that's quite hard to tell, because only so much of it is linked to, I suppose, what's publicly out there in terms of his fitness. And bear in mind, fitness has played 2 parts in his particular story, and 2 games in particular. There is the Hobart game, which is, which ends with him off the pitch as the last wicket, losing his stumps. But in the midst of that was being called out by John Lewis for not being fit enough because he has a back spasm. He then goes away and essentially forces Ben Stokes into bringing him back in the side. And I don't know, you could look through Ben Stokes' tenure and come to the conclusion that he's the only player to have done that. Bear in mind that Matthew Potts was the man in possession from the start of that summer, and Robinson makes a compelling case to Stokes that, he is fitter, he is as good as, he's ever been, and comes in, and it feels like we're on a bit of a clear run ahead to Ollie Robinson becoming the leader of the attack. Certainly that was, how it was framed in terms of the transition from Anderson and Broad. But then you fast forward to that India Test on the tour at the start of 2024 in Rajkot, where he breaks down again, and it's a very similar issue. I think this particular issue comes when he's batting, and his pace is down again, and it feels like he's let England down. And yeah, we're in this situation where he's over there playing grade cricket, essentially trying to jumpstart his career again.
Yeah, I think clearly there are sort of two big issues, which are the perception of his attitude within the English management plus the fitness thing. And I think they obviously go hand in hand to a certain extent. If you think the last two tests that he played, he didn't complete, which were Leeds in the 23 Ashes, and then obviously in India in early 2024. The perception has basically been that England's management have lost patience with him. I think Rob Key is out there saying we think he's potentially one of the best bowlers in the world when he's up at 83, 84 miles an hour, but too often he's slipped towards 75, 76 miles an hour when he's decidedly not. It does, I suppose, frame an interesting question about the attack that England have taken over there, because if there's one type of seam bowler in particular in the attack that England are missing, they've obviously got a lot of genuinely quick bowlers this time, probably more so than they ever have before in an attack going over to Australia. But we also know that Australian conditions have changed a bit in the past few years, and Steve Smith has made reference to this by saying, it's not really that sort of old school English seamer in the squad. It feels like it was a glaring missed opportunity, really, from Robinson's perspective, to put himself in that conversation, because I think he could have been, if he was at his best and if he was bowling like the bowler that we have seen in international cricket previously, he could have been perfect for this squad. Yeah, and I think that's probably quite an accurate way of framing it. It is a missed opportunity for Robinson. And then even when we talk about that, you almost have to break down, so how did we get to this point? Because surely it's just not two back spasms in the space of 3 years. And I suppose the frustration comes from he himself, in an interview with the Telegraph, suggesting that it would have been down to his personal life. Now, a lot of that is out there about, I suppose, the breakdown of relationships and whatever, whether they be personal or professional. But I do think the interesting thing is England were so in on him that he actually broke into the Test side really during that COVID summer. It was when they were bubbling at the at Southampton, and he was a member of the Lions, and he was bowling in the nets with Anderson, Broad, and whoever else, and the three of them became quite close, in part because of how good Robinson was. And I can't remember which backroom staff member it was, but I think they were in like a recreational room, playing a game, and Robinson said something to Anderson that, well, put it this way, like not many people get away with saying to Anderson, and Anderson laughed, and then a member of staff who was there turned to Robinson and said, I think he likes you because he doesn't laugh at many people who have a go at him. And they were his biggest advocates going through, and to the point that, I don't know if you remember, but in the Adelaide Test in 21-22, Root came out and basically had a go at Broad and Anderson. It was the first game they played on that tour, and he basically had a go at them, saying their lengths weren't, they weren't full enough and that they should know better. And I think Robinson told me himself in an interview that when they got their pitch maps through, as they used to at the time, he was the one who said, like, lads, this is not good enough. So he was clearly someone taking charge who had this path laid out for him. And I think the fear is that as long as Ben Stokes and Brendan McCullum are in charge of the England team,
and we could probably include Rob Key in this as managing director, it's very unlikely that Ollie Robinson will be playing Test cricket for England because they have given him chances and they probably feel that they've been, I don't know, is betrayed too strong a word?
Do you think they've missed a trick with their attack? Do you think they need a bowler like Robinson, even if not Robinson himself? I don't know who that would necessarily be.
And that is a problem, isn't it? Because I suppose you would say Sam Cook, but yeah, and maybe it is Sam Cook. And maybe if this was earlier in Sam Cook's life, then maybe he would have, chosen to come on this Lions tour. I'm not entirely sure of like the, how it has worked behind the scenes with regards to whether he would have been available for it. But certainly, he chose to go out there and made a good impression, and in previous tours was allowed to pursue, franchise opportunities instead. But yeah, maybe they have. I think Gus Atkinson obviously is the closest England have to that, and I think actually that's probably more his vibe anyway. I think sometimes we get lost in this new attack because the average pace is higher, but Atkinson is ultimately that bowler who just operates at a slightly higher pace because he has a very repeatable action, because he is very tight to the stumps and set in his ways in terms of lines and lengths in particular, that he is ultimately that metronomic bowler. He just happens to bowl quicker than the other two people he used to do it. So I suppose we've got quite a clear indication of who England are leaning towards with regards to their number 3, with Ollie Pope batting in that position for England in their warm-up against the Lions at Lilac Hills, with Bethel batting at 3 for the Lions. Given how Ben Stokes and Brendan McCullum have spoken about Zack Crawley since the start of the 2022 summer, this Ashes series is the end game. Matt, will Zack Crawley come good in Australia? What are we going to get from him this winter?
Yeah, this is it. You're right. This is when we finally get to make a sort of lasting judgment on Zack Crawley. I think similar to Ollie Pope, he's played a lot of tests. He's not really delivered. He averages 31 as an opener from a big sample. No one has ever opened the batting more in Test cricket and averaged as little as he does. And yet, there's that element of Zack Crawley that makes you think maybe it could work. And I think the reason I find him fascinating is this bizarre trait that he has of doing better against better teams and better bowlers. You think, just for example, through the summer, Jasprit Bumrah got him out once in that whole series. Nitish Kumar Reddy got him out twice. And it's the same trend in Australia. He has really, really good head-to-head records against Josh Hazlewood and Mitchell Starc, based mainly on the 23 Ashes where he was England's top run scorer. But he also doesn't have a great record against Cam Green or Scott Boland or even Mitch Marsh. The numbers are stark. I think he averages 43 against balls above 84 miles an hour from seamers and averages 27 against balls below 84 miles an hour from seamers. So it's going to be a bizarre spectacle, the idea that maybe Australia's best ploy would be to get Green or Webster into the attack pretty early.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I do feel like this is the series where final judgments will be made on Crawley. He's been given a never-ending rope, really, by the current management. He's, every test he's been fit for, he's played. He's opened the batting. You compare that to Australia and their constant revolving door of openers. An Australian opener with the same record as Zack Crawley would have been dropped long ago, probably recalled and then dropped again by this point. I can't wait to see how it goes. My hunch is that he'll do reasonably well, given the nature of particularly the first couple of tests, the surfaces you generally get there with a bit of bounce. That should suit him against the short ball. But if it goes badly, I think it's, there's every chance it could be the end of his Test career.
Yeah, and then at the same time, I see potential for something in between, which would be the 2024 India series that he had, where he was England's top scorer and didn't score 100. Just churned out consistent runs and good runs, but yeah, ended up just not really cashing in and almost having a series that you couldn't pin on him, but you did think, if you're in, then a bigger score would be nice. It's interesting. He's played 59 tests and only scored 500s. Only 2 of them have come in victories. The first test on the Pakistan tour in 2022 and Zimbabwe at the start of the 2025 summer. And in those innings, at least 2 other people scored hundreds. There were 4 centurions in that first innings in Pakistan, and his other 3 have come in draws. 2 of them because of the weather, 1 because of a pretty flat deck in North Sound. I sometimes get drawn in by the talk of him being suited to Australian pitches and the innings that they all use. And I say all as in like everyone at the ECB who vouches for Zack Crawley, even before actually he went on that run in 2023 into 2024. But the innings in the second digs at Sydney,
77 was
he gets a 77, and he plays a pull shot off Mitchell Stark, I think, and that shot was put to us at the start of that 2022 summer of why they need to invest in Zack Crawley, because he is the kind of player who can take a game away from you. Now, obviously, we know from the hundreds stat that's not quite the case, but you do see the logic, and especially in Australia where you can, batters have been overawed by the bounce and it ruins their game. Ultimately, the conditions that Zack Crawley has grown up in are apparently, less suited to his game than the conditions England are about to face in Australia. And even with the talk of pitches being more seam friendly, it is the bounce ultimately that brings him into the conversation as far as someone who can give England something that they've not previously had.
Mm.
And I also think there's an element of he's basically got the mentality of a top Premier League striker, in that you've got to forget the misses. And every time you talk to him, when he has that horrendous series in New Zealand at the end of 2024, where he's Matt Henry'd, across both islands, there is a sense that he walks off forlorn, but you do get that sense that, he'll probably forget about it because he's had so many chances. And because of that, he's had so many different passages where he has failed that he's got used to dealing with that. Mm. And if they're able to have conditioned him that he can go to Australia and think, oh, great, this is where I belong, then from their perspective, brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's almost this self-perpetuating idea, which is that if you keep convincing yourself you're good at something, is that enough to then actually make you good at the thing? We're about to find out, I suppose, one way or the other. You obviously have the advantage that's spoken to a lot about England's opening partnership, with the fact that you have, the polar opposites, most complementary pair you can imagine, with a right-hander and a left-hander and a tall and a short, which I think is definitely I think that's real. I don't think that's just a myth. And we have seen, a lot of examples over the years of teams having to completely change their strategy because of the fact that Crawley is off to a flyer, and I include Duckett in that as well, obviously, as an opening partnership. The Oval being a good example this summer, where he scored a really quick 50 that did seem to change the mood of the game almost entirely. The problem is then, of course, that he very rarely sort of seems to go on and turn that into a match-winning score. As discussed, he's only got 200s and wins. The mood can shift very quickly in Test cricket, as often seems to when he's playing. So yeah, I think it's going to be a real interesting one. I'm fascinated to see how Australia sort of decide to attack him as well, given those sort of the well-known weaknesses. Will they just hang it wide outside his off stump and let him go chasing? Will they rely on Stark and Hazelwood, who haven't done well against him in the past and he's got on top of with their extra pace? Or will they, play on his ego and say, here's Scott Boland, here's Cam Green, go and do something silly?
Do you think if this series doesn't go well for him, that this is the end of Zack Crawley, the Test cricketer?
It could be. I think it depends how badly it goes for England as well. On top of that, I think if it's a sort of the sort of defeat that we've seen in the past 3 Ashes tours, a real, a hammering, a 4-0, a 5-0, something like that, then I think there's every chance. I think if a new captain or coach came in, I think that would be an easy, if they were clearing the decks, I think that would be an easy call to make. I actually find it generally hard to work out in this series what's going to happen in the aftermath if England are beaten, let's say 3-1 or 3-2, and it's a competitive series, but they lose. I think it's really hard to see what happens next. Obviously, the focus will move on to the next Ashes. It always does at home, where England will be, should on paper have a stronger chance of winning as the home team. But yeah, Crawley will be an interesting case study in that event. I think if after having played, let's say 64 tests, if he plays all 5 of this, then he's still averaging in the low 30s. There's every chance that'll be him done. Then again, who's your man that you're bringing in? The first ball of the last 2 Ashes series have been extremely memorable and contrasting as well. Stark knocking over Rory Burns' leg stump first ball, Zack Crawley nailing a cover drive for 4. Are we going to get a third instalment in that series, or is it going to be fall into the Mitchell Stark to Adam Lyth or James Anderson to Cameron Bancroft, long forgotten first balls of Ashes series gone by?
I feel like the build-up has been so big and so over the top that something will happen for that first ball. And I mean, like historically, yeah, as you recap there is something. There is always something on it, despite the fact that if you look at if you break down the percentages, it's most of them go off without any real without any real note. I think England need to bowl first for their sake, and if that happens, I don't think there will be anything on the first ball. I really think it will be much of a muchness. It might even be just a wrong length ball from Archer to Khawaja that goes down the leg side and doesn't get wided because it's a test, and we go again. But I feel like if England are batting, because things have been so febrile in Australia, even before England were on the ground, that there is something about, they just have this way, and this almost the way their sport works is something always happens when they're in control of it. And I feel like, yeah, whether it's Crawley going for another 4 or even trying to defend, there'll be something happening. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, Stark to Crawley could be pretty box office if you think of the 2 series kind of converging on one another, 21-22 and 2023 in England. But
also 23, Crawley was top run scorer and Stark was top wicket taker. So yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? We do always attach a lot of narrative to these things. If you think back to 23 series, obviously Crawley hitting that first ball for 4 did feel like a huge moment. It felt like almost the release of pressure of all the energy that had gone into the build-up. You got to remember that England did lose that test.
They did.
England went 2-0 down in that series.
It's really what happened at the end of the day that was more spectacular when England declared.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's an interesting one in that we do always put these narratives back on. I do think you can read something into what happens on the first ball quite often. If you think, just for another example, Steve Harmison in 06-07, I think has been speaking recently about, feeling very undercooked and unfit going into that series. Didn't feel like he was ready for the moment. Obviously, that first ball ends up in Freddie Flintoff's hands at first slip. And I think that sort of told you a certain tale about how the team's build-up had gone. I think you can definitely make that case for 21-22 with Burns. And even in 23 with England losing that test, I think it was, if not necessarily it didn't necessarily dictate or define the series in any way, but I think it provided an immediate reminder to Australia, or I wouldn't necessarily say a wake-up call, but a sort of a jolt that this isn't going to be the same series that you often have. There is something there is some substance behind the bluster, and it's not just going to be an autopilot series where you're going to play and plan like you normally do. You're going to have to do things a bit differently. We obviously saw Cummins reacting with field changes pretty early on that day.
Yeah. And I think what's particularly interesting is we're not talking about this as something that we've plucked out of our minds. This is a genuine talking point, and the players will know that as well. In 2021-22, ahead of the build-up to that first ball, Rory Burns was asked, if he'd thought about it, and he said no. Now, Rory Burns, in his lifetime, has only been an opening batter. He obviously thinks about the first ball he's going to face in any game, regardless. And him saying no was his way of downplaying the thing that we're talking about right now, that there is something about it that matters so much more than other first deliveries. And it was only when he was bowled leg stump that his response, which was essentially like, no, I've not really thought about it, it was only then that that quote from that particular press engagement was pulled out and used in people's copy of that first day. Because at the time, everyone knew what he was talking about. Everyone knew that he obviously has thought about it, but he's trying to play it down. It's kind of wasted words on both our sides. You know, quoting him and teeing up the quote, why bother using it? And then it became the most important quote from that press conference, probably the most important quote that Rory Burns has given in his entire life, to the point where this Halloween, or the Halloween just gone, Rory Burns reposted a story of someone in Australia going as Rory Burns to a Halloween party, which was stepping outside his stumps and, you know, his leg stump being clipped back. I would recommend you seeking it out. It is an incredible costume, but one that still lives with Rory Burns to this day.
And that is the reality of these things as well, is that they are, you know, because of the hype and the magnitude of the Ashes, they stick with people. You know, Phil de Freitas, Steve Harmison, for everything that Harmison achieved for England, he's still, in Australia, probably best known for being the guy that bowled the first ball of the Ashes to slip.